When you start After Effects for the first time, you will be greeted with the welcome screen. Now, if you don't want this each time you boot up the software, you can always come down here and uncheck Show Welcome Screen at Startup. That way, you'll boot right into the software and you can access the file menu from there to create your new projects or open up existing projects if you wish. But if you are looking at the welcome screen like I am, we will want to create a new composition. Now, creating a composition will in effect also create a project file. We can have multiple compositions if we wish. It's sort of like Premiere if you are at all familiar with that software. You have a project file and you have sequences within that project file. A composition is kind of like a sequence. So we will be creating a new composition here, although throughout the rest of the series we will be working with existing project files I have included with this course so that you have something to work with as we progress through After Effects. So let's go ahead and click on New Composition. And what's going to happen here is we will need to define some settings for this composition, and you'll have to do this each time when you create a new composition. So different compositions can have different settings. First, let's name our composition. Now, in this case, we'll want something descriptive. It's best to keep things as descriptive yet as concise as possible. So let's say you're going to create a sequence or a composition that has a rain scene. Maybe you have a shot of someone in the rain. Well, we can come up here and we could put Max in rain as an example. So once you have that, you'll want to check out the presets for your composition, or you can go in and create some custom settings. The presets give you access to a lot of popular options when it comes to resolution and frame rate for video. So if we come over here and click on the drop-down menu for preset, you can see we have many different options. Now, in the case of this series, I know I'll be working with 1080p footage at 24 frames per second. So the best case for me, if I were to choose a preset, would probably be going down here to HD TV 1080 24. So I'll go ahead and click that. Now again, this will depend on your footage. You may have 4K footage. In that case, you may have to go in here and change some settings yourself to make sure that the composition can accommodate for such a large resolution. So you can see right here now I have my width and height, and I can also define these if I want. So let's say again, if I had a custom width or height, I could come in here and I could click and I could change the numbers, or I could take my cursor and hover over the number and click and drag left or right to create the resolution I want. Next is the pixel aspect ratio. Now in this case, I know I want square pixels, but let's say you were working with an anamorphic lens. Well, you can come down here and choose anamorphic as an example if you wish, but we'll just leave it at square pixels. You have the frame rate, and that was defined by my preset, but you can always come in here and even click on this arrow and choose from a list of popular frame rates. You can also choose if you want to have your frame rate drop when you're working in your composition in After Effects, and this can speed up performance at the expense, of course, dropping frames, which is right here. You can choose if you want that on or off. You also have your resolution. Again, this is with working with the composition and not the final output. So by default, you can have a full resolution when you're working with your composition, or you can choose half, third, quarter, or you can go to custom, which will give you access to just how many pixels you want to work with horizontally and vertically when you're in your composition. I'll just cancel out of that. And for right now, I recommend leaving it at full. When we start working, if you're having performance issues, we can adjust this later on. And then you have your time code and your duration. We can leave the time code as is. The duration is more important here because we can set up just how long we want the composition to be. So let's say, as an example, we know that the video clips we're going to bring in will equal out to about 2 minutes. Well, then you could just come over here and we could just change this then to 2 minutes, just like that. And then you'd be good to go. Now, at any time, you can always go back to these settings and change the duration should it become longer or shorter than you first anticipated. And then you have the background color. This will show up whenever you have no footage or images currently in your composition. So you could choose a black background color, or you could use the eyedropper and you could pick a different color. Like we could go right here. You can see that the OK button is blue, so we could pick that blue color. We could pick gray. Or if there's an image or piece of footage that you want to grab from, you could do that as well, just as long as it's on one of your monitors. Or you can click on the color swatch here and choose from any color that you wish. In this case, we'll just stick with black and click OK. Now there are some advanced options with your composition settings. We can click on Advanced right up here, and you can choose the renderer for your 3D effects. We'll just leave this at Classic 3D. You can also do different things, such as preserving your frame rate when you're working with nested files, or preserve the resolution when working with nested files. And these are all things that you can play with later on. We're just going to leave this all at default. The same goes with your motion blur. You can adjust how the motion blur looks right here with the shutter angle and shutter phase. But again, we'll leave all of that as is. But as you get more used to After Effects, you can take a look at these options later on if you want to change things up. So once all of your settings are good, you can click OK, and you'll now have a new composition in your new project file. A composition. So now, what happens if you want to save your project? Well, if you're at all familiar with other software, this should seem pretty familiar. As you can see right now, our project is untitled and it has an asterisk next to it at the top here. That asterisk means it's unsaved. So if at any time you're working and you glance up and you see there's an asterisk and you've done a lot of work, be sure you save. Always save as often as you can. After Effects has a built-in fail-safe, so in the event it were to crash, it does have an autosave feature, so if you were to lose your project, it will try to back up as much as possible. But don't rely on that, save as often as you can. And in order to save, all you have to do is go up to File, and then Save. Now you can use Command S if you're on Mac, or Control S if you're on Windows if you're looking for the shortcut. You can also Save As, which will allow you to create a copy of the file. You can go to Save As and you can make a new name, and then you are good to go. So let's go to Save, and you'll want to locate a folder to where you want to save your project. Now, in this case, I'm just going to go into my After Effects Fundamentals folder, into the work files, and I'm going to give this a name. So I'll just come up here, and in the case of your project, you'd probably want to name this something pertaining to your film. So in this case, I'm just going to name it Train Simple AE Course. But let's say you are working on a film and you know the name of the film, or you know the sequence that you're working on, you'd probably want to save it as that. Again, you want to be as explicit and concise as you can with these names. So once you're good, you can also glance down here and see the file format is set to Adobe After Effects project. You can also do a template project, but this is the one that we're interested in. So once you're good, you can click Save, and the file is now saved. You can see there's no longer an asterisk, and we now have a name and a path right up here. So you can then, if you want, go ahead and close After Effects without any fear of losing your work. And you can always reopen After Effects and click on the Open Project button to open up your project, or you can browse to your files right here, and you can see it's saved right here, and simply double click on it to open it back up. And there we go. We now have our project back up and running. Now there's nothing on it, but we were able to save the project itself. And that is all there is to it when it comes to saving and opening up your project files in After Effects. Becoming familiar and comfortable with your workspace is important no matter which software you're working with. Luckily, with After Effects and most Adobe software, you can easily rearrange your workspace to suit your needs. So first, let's open up the Lesson 2 project file, which is located in your course files for this series. And this is a very simple project file, and I wanted to keep it simple for the beginning of this course. And we're not going to work with the video much, but it just gives us something to look at as we work with the workspace. So first, right at the top, you have the ability to change a preset workspace to your liking. So if we go up here and click on the drop-down menu, you can see we have all sorts of different options. We have standard, paint, motion tracking, and so on. So as an example, if I click on animation, you can see that it brings up some other options for us to work with, especially on the right side. But if I were to go to, let's say, motion tracking, you can see it also changes things, and we now have the motion tracking panel on the side. So really, it just depends on how you want to work. In the case of the series, we'll stick with standard, and we may make changes as we go along just to accommodate the recording area. Keep in mind that we are recording in 720p for this series, and so things are going to look a little bit more claustrophobic. And I also advise, if you do have two monitors, to take advantage of that workflow, because being able to put, for instance, your video onto your second monitor and then have all your tools on your main monitor can really help when it comes to looking at your video and performing different tasks. Now, with whatever workspace you choose, as I said, you can move things around. As an example, I have a panel right here called Effects and Presets. So let's click on this area right here and just drag anywhere we want. You can see as we drag around, we're getting different highlights. It highlights here, it highlights there. This is indicating we can place this panel in any of these areas. So I could come over here as an example and place it right here just by releasing. Now, of course, that gets rid of our video. We would have to go back here to see it, but you can rearrange your panels however you see fit. I can come over here, click and drag and move this over there. I could move the timeline, let's say, over here. And of course, I've just created a completely different workspace just by moving a couple of panels around. Now, at any time, if you want, you can always go up to your menu here and choose to reset your workspace. Just reset standard, click yes, and now we are back to the default. Also, if you create a customized workspace like we just did and you want to save it so that you can use it for future projects, you can always come up here, click on the drop-down menu, and choose New Workspace. You can name the workspace. Let's just name this TS Workspace. Click OK. You can see now it's set to TS Workspace, and now we can click and drag and move our stuff around if we wanted to, just like this. And again, I'm just kind of moving things around at random. And now, if we come back here, you can see we now have the TS Workspace, so we can switch between standard and the new TS Workspace. And at any time, if you want, you can come back here, come down to Delete Workspace. You can click that, and then you can remove it. So I'm going to go back to standard so that we are good to go and everything is at default. One more thing to keep in mind as you work with your workspace, especially in an environment like this where we have not a lot of room to work with, if you put your cursor over any of these panels, for instance, let's come over here to the project panel, and I hit the tilde key, which is the key to the left of your 1 key on your keyboard. It's also usually positioned right below the escape key. If I just tap that, I can expand any of these panels. So I can do that. I can come down here. I can expand the timeline. Just tap it to go back, here, and so on. So if you do need an expanded view of any of the panels, just use the tilde key on your keyboard. Like most Adobe software, there are preferences that you can go into and adjust in After Effects, and this can affect a wide range of options. There's different sections that can affect how your RAM is used, the audio hardware connected to your computer, how things are labeled, color-coded, and so on. So you have a lot of options here, and I'm just going to touch on some of these just so you know where it's all at in the event you need to go in and make some changes. So what you'll need to do first, if you're on a Mac, is go up to After Effects, Preferences, and then General. If you're on Windows, you'll find the preferences under Edit. So once you find your preferences, go ahead and go to General. Now first, as you can see, we have a lot of general options we can cover. Everything from showing tool tips to create layers at composition start time, and everything in between. There's just a lot of stuff here. And I'm going to leave everything at default here as I work. Again, if I need to make changes throughout this course, I will definitely let you guys know as I make those changes, so that way you can see how everything is affected. But for right now, I think we should be good to go. And the general area just covers basically general stuff that doesn't fall into any other category. Next is previews. If we click on this can affect how you preview your videos. Now, if your resources are limited, you may want to come in here and make some adjustments. As an example, when it comes to fast previews, you can do the adaptive resolution limit, which is at 1/8 right now. We click on this, we can adjust it to 1/16, 1/4, 1/2, and so forth. So you can really go in and make those changes if you need to. You can also click on your GPU information to get a more accurate representation of what's going on. You also have your viewer quality when it comes to zoom quality, color management quality, and you can go in there and choose if it's more accurate or if it's faster. Again, this all depends on your system requirements and what you're looking to get out of when it comes to After Effects. As a general rule, After Effects runs pretty slow, unless of course you have an incredibly powerful workstation environment. In that case, you probably won't run into many issues, but more often than not, you're going to see some slowdown here and there. And if that's becoming an issue and what you're doing in your workspace isn't helping, you can always come in here and make some adjustments if you wish. Display gives you display settings. As an example, we can set motion path, so we can not see motion path, or we can do no more than 15 seconds, or no more than a certain amount of keyframes if you want. We can disable thumbnails in the project panel. That can save, again, on resources. And you have basic stuff such as show both timecode and frames in the timeline panel. So again, just depends on what you want to do when you're working in After Effects. We have the import settings. So we can go in, as an example, let's say we have an image. We can choose to bring the image in at the length of the composition. So if you have a 30-second composition, you can choose right here that the image will automatically be set to 30 seconds of display time. Or you can choose to have a default custom time, such as 1 second if you want to check that on. And the sequence footage has to deal with bringing in a bunch of images at once. You can choose the default frame rate for that. And you have a bunch of other options here as well. Again, I'm going to leave this at default because if I go through each one, we'll be here for hours going through all the preferences. And you really have, at this point, no real base to go off of when it comes to all this. You don't know what this really does because we haven't dived into the meat of After Effects yet. So I'm just going to point things out here as we go along. Going to output, you can choose different output settings. There's grids and guides. You can choose the color of the grids if you want, or the guides. There's also safe margins. You can see right down there. We can go to labels. Here, we can choose what we want our labels to look like. As an example, by default, a composition is going to be sandstone colored. Video will be aqua, audio will be seafoam, and so on and so forth. Media and disk cache. This has to deal with performance when it comes to After Effects. As you render, you're going to cache different files, and you can choose a maximum disk cache size, which is set to 100 gigabytes right now. If things are slowing down, you can always empty your disk cache. This will, of course, reset all of your renders, but you can do so if you need to check things out and try to boost your performance. There's video preview, and this has to do with your video devices and your monitors. So you can go in and set this up. So if you want to display on a second monitor, you can by all means do that. And there's other options here, and this will also depend on your work setup as well. You'll probably have different hardware than me, so this might look a little bit different. Appearance, you can choose, for instance, use label color for label handles and paths, use label color for related tabs, and basically this all comes down to just how things are going to look when it comes to the interface. So you can come in here and you can toggle these on and off, and you can just see what it does for you as you're working. Of course, brightness is a big one. You can come in here and we could increase this all the way up like that, or go all the way down. I'll just put that back to default. Autosave, and I mentioned auto-saving before, but After Effects will try to save your project every 20 minutes. And again, you can bring this down or up depending on your needs. We could go all the way down to 1 minute, all the way up to whatever we want, but I'll leave it at the default at 20. Again, I advise you just save as often as you can. The shortcut key is your friend. Control S if you're on Windows, Command S if you're on Mac. Just get used to hitting that as often as you can, especially when you make big changes. That way everything is saved as you work in case something were to happen. You have memory and multiprocessing, and this is interesting because you can calculate just how much RAM is being used for your Adobe software. Right now, I have 11 gigabytes of RAM reserved for After Effects, and I currently have 16 gig of RAM available to me, 5 of which is reserved for other applications. Now, you'll want to be careful with this because if you start adjusting this, and let's say you bring the RAM down for other applications to 0, let's say you just want to go full blown and you want all the RAM available for After Effects, you're going to have complications with your operating system because, of course, your operating system needs RAM to run. So do other background tasks. So make sure that you leave enough RAM available to other applications so you don't run into issues that you might not think of as you're working with After Effects or any Adobe software. You also have audio hardware. You can set your recording device if you wish, and I'm just using my Avid Fast Track Solo. This will all look different to you because I'm sure you'll have different equipment. You also have your audio output mapping right here. Again, it's outputting to my headset, which is the Avid Fast Track Solo, and you can go in and make those changes if you wish. You can come up here, you can see I have different things I can choose, but I'm just gonna go with that one. And we have sync settings, and this has to deal with your Creative Cloud account. Let's say you're working with After Effects on a different computer and you want to sync it to your After Effects here so all of your settings are the same. This is where you'd go in and do so, and you would choose just what you want to save if you want to. And you choose just what you want to sync up so that everything is good to go when you are ready to work. So that is a basic overview of the software preferences. Again, a lot of this can probably be left alone. However, if you do run into issues down the line and you need to make some changes, you can do so in this panel. When working in After Effects, there are certain settings you can change depending on your needs, and these pertain to the project file itself. In the previous video, we looked at software settings that we could change, and that of course affects the entire piece of software so that After Effects will work differently as a whole. So if you're looking to gain access to the project preferences, you'll first need to have a project open, and you can always go to the work files and open up the Lesson 2 project file. So once you have done that, we'll go up to File, and then go all the way down to Project Settings. Now in your project settings, right here, you can see we don't have a whole lot of options, at least compared to the software settings. That was pretty extensive. So here you can change the time display for your project, whether you're using timecode or frames. If you're using the timecode, you can set your footage start time, so use media source, so depending on what videos you're bringing in. Or if you want, you can set it to just 0. That way you have everything at default if you want it to be that way. You can also use frames if you wish, and from here you can adjust then. Use feet plus frames for 35mm or 16mm, and you can do a frame count timecode conversion and some other things here as well. In all honesty, since you're starting off, I would leave this at default as timecode, but you can change it in here if you need to. For your color settings, you can set the depth. You can also set the working space. This will allow you to set a color profile for After Effects. So let's say you need to work with a certain profile because a client wants it to be as such, or you're just trying to emulate a certain color theme. You can definitely pick one of these profiles or load more in externally and then bring them in. Again, we'll set it to none, but it's there should you need it in the future. And on the bottom, you have your audio settings, and simply you can change the sample rate. Right now it's set to 48, but we can come down here and we could decrease the sample rate if we wanted to, which would make the audio sound less clear, but it can help, again, when you're trying to render things out. If you're having resource issues, you may want to try to lower this. But again, that is up to you. And there's nothing else on the bottom of this panel. The limited workspace we have here doesn't allow us to see the OK and cancel buttons, but once you're done, you would click OK and your settings would be saved. So that is how you access your project preferences in Adobe After Effects. Importing media into After Effects is incredibly important. This is how we take all the pieces of the puzzle and bring them together so that you can create your masterpiece. And there's a few different ways we can go about importing. First, let's take a look at the project panel. It's this panel right here, and you can see right now we have one file in our project, and that is the composition. We created this a few videos back. So how do we get more files into here? Because right now we are working with nothing, just a blank composition. Well, there's a few ways you can go about it. First, you can right-click in the project area and then choose Import. Now, when you go to Import, you have a few different options. You can import a file, which is like a video or image file. You can do multiple files. So let's say you have different files dispersed throughout different folders on your computer. You can go through and grab each of these because the prompt to import will just keep popping up until you're done. You can also import a Premiere project file, a vanishing point, and a few other file types. So it really depends on what you need to do. For this video, we'll be working with just the standard file import, which is the first option. So there's that way. Another way is simply to double-click on the project window itself. So just double-click, and it brings up the import file prompt. Cancel out of that. We can also, if you want, go to File and Import, and you get the same options here as well. And the final way to import is to use your shortcut keys, which in this case would be Command-I if you're on Mac, Control-I if you're on Windows. So whichever way you decide, let's go ahead and import a file. So let's click on that first option, and we're going to browse to the Lesson 2 project folder, which is in your course files, and we're going to go under Videos right here, and we're going to find the Lesson 2 video.mp4 file. So let's go ahead and click on that, and then click Open. You can see now we have a new video in the project window, and it gives us some basic information. We can see the name, we can also see the dimensions, the duration, the frame rate, the colors, the codec, and the audio quality. In addition to that, we have a thumbnail, and at a glance we can tell there's audio because of the waveform right here. So that's pretty handy. Now let's say you have a bunch of files and you don't want to sift through file after file, you want some way to organize. Well, luckily you can create folders in your project panel. Simply put your cursor down at the bottom and click on this icon right here, Create a New Folder. You can see we now have a new untitled folder, and we could just name this, let's just say Videos for right now, and then hit Enter. So in this case, we could come up here, take this video, click and drag it and put it into the Videos folder. So pretty easy. We can expand that and we can see what's inside the folder. So you could create multiple folders. Let's say you have certain shots, or maybe you have images, you have other file types. You could create folders for those and organize this any way you see fit. Another thing you can do too, let me just bring this out like this and then delete the folder, is when we import, we could just come out here and click on this folder and click Open. You can see now it brings the entire folder in. So let's say you have all these video files in one folder. You don't have to go through and click on each one, or click and hold and shift and click on the bottom one. You can just simply bring the folder in and you're good to go. Let me go ahead and just delete that. Delete, and we're good. And as you can see, deleting is easy. You can simply click on a file and hit the delete key, or come down here and click on the trash can icon. You can also rename files, so we can come up here and right click on a file and choose rename, and we can name this then Max Draws Gun, and you can see it changes the name to make it easier for us when we're working. And this just changes the name in After Effects, not the actual file on your computer. We can also right click on the file, and we can do a few different things here. We can do new comp from selection, and we can create a proxy and all sorts of stuff. But what's interesting is we can come down here and we can choose to replace the footage. So let's say you have a new shot that you want to update, and you don't want to mess with the effects that you've added to the shot. You don't want any of that to go away. Well, you could replace this file with another just by going right here and going to File. You could browse for it and then you could replace it. And this works especially well if you have files that are the same duration, because that way you're just putting it right over the other and there's basically no changes that need to be made then, unless if you have time-sensitive effects that are not going to pan out. You can reload footage in case if you're having issues with the footage not loading into your project file. You can reveal in Finder or Explorer, depending on which operating system you have. In this case, for us, it's Finder. Clicking that will just bring up the file right there on your computer so you can see where it's at. And one final note is you can change the label color of your file. You can see right here, we have a label and we have a color. Well, you can simply click on that and you can choose a different color. So in this case, we could choose red. And you can see now we have a different label. And again, that's just for workflow purposes so that you can glance up and you can see the file. And you could, for instance, color code all certain shots, let's say of Max in red, or you could color code all your compositions and so on and so forth. So really that just depends on how you want to approach it. But anyway, that's how you work with importing in Adobe After Effects. In addition to importing regular footage and images, you can also work with Photoshop files, Premiere files, and even Illustrator files. Importing these files basically works the same way, but there are some different settings you can work with before bringing them in. So let's import a file. I'm simply going to just double click here on my project window, and I'm first going to look for my Photoshop file. So I'm going to go to my work files here, Lesson 2, and you can see here we have an images folder and the Photoshop file. You will also find a similar setup in your work files for this course. So locate the Photoshop file, click it, and let's open it up. Now what's going to happen here is if you're at all familiar with Photoshop, it works with layers. And if you're going really deep into the graphic design aspects, you're going to work with quite a few layers. So here we can dictate how we want to import this file. As an example, we can choose the import kind. We can choose to import this as footage so that After Effects sees it as footage and treats it as such. Or we can make it a composition. Or we can have a composition that retains the layer sizes. So if you want the composition to fit the size of the Photoshop file just as it is, you can choose that last option. So for the sake of this demonstration, we'll just go with that last option. Now for your layer options, you can choose editable layer styles, or you can merge layer styles into footage. So you can use layer styles in Photoshop. So do you want to be able to edit those, or do you just want to integrate them into the footage so that they're there and you can work on other aspects of the project? So that's something you can play with if you wish. And once you're good, you can click OK. So in this case, what's going to happen is it brought in my Photoshop file. You can see right here, it basically deconstructed all of the layers and created compositions for them. It also brought in my Photoshop files that I was using. And we have a main composition for the Photoshop file itself. In order to access a composition, all you have to do is double click on it. So let's go ahead and double click on this new Photoshop file composition. You can see what has happened here is we have the composition in shot. It has framed it to the Photoshop file, and we have some layers down here that we get to work with if we wish when it comes to editing this composition. So this is pretty cool stuff. Integrating Photoshop is really easy with After Effects. Let's go ahead now and just click on these files and delete them. And let's bring in an Illustrator file. So I'm just going to go to File, Import. And I have an Illustrator file in that images folder in your course files. So let's click and open it up. And as you can see, it brings it in pretty seamlessly. It brings it in as vector art. So from here, you could go in and we can modify it. We could do whatever we want with it. We could create a new composition and we could work with it. And it basically works like an image. I'll go ahead and remove that. And finally, we can import Premiere project files. Now you can integrate with Premiere in a variety of ways, and we'll probably be exploring a couple different ways through these two After Effects courses. but let's just go ahead and right-click, go down to Import, and choose Adobe Premiere Pro Project. Now I'm going to browse here to my documents. I'm going to go into my Premiere course, and I'm just going to pull a Premiere project file from that course. So right here, I'm just going to click and open. Now what's going to happen is it's going to ask if you want to import all the sequences. Now when you work with Premiere, you can have as many sequences as you want, or you may just have one. If you just want to bring in a certain sequence, you can use the drop-down arrow here and choose the sequence you want. Or you can bring them all in. It just depends on what you want to do. You can also choose if you want to import audio. So once you're good, you can click OK, and you can see now it brings a folder in along with a new composition, and we have a video. Now, for whatever reason, this video is set as a placeholder. It didn't come in. And this can happen sometimes when you're working with various different project files. And if that's the case, we can right-click and we can go to Reload Footage. And if that doesn't work, we can always replace the footage. So I could go to Replace Footage, File. I could browse for a file here. Let's just go with that one and click Open. So you can see now when I go into this composition, it acts just like any composition in After Effects. We have the video, we have the composition set, and we can start editing. As I said, there's different ways you can work with this, and later on, I'll show you how you can integrate Adobe After Effects with Premiere very seamlessly, so that you can go from one timeline to the other and make alterations on the fly. But that's just a little bit more on how to import in After Effects. There may come a point when you're working with footage when you realize I need to convert this footage to another aspect ratio, or I need to change the frame rate of the file itself. Well, you can do this by interpreting footage. So in order to pull this off, you'll first need to have some footage in your project bin. Once you have it, as we do right here, you'll need to right-click and go down to Interpret Footage, and then choose Main. A new window will appear, and here you can change any option that you wish pertaining to the footage. To start with, you can choose the alpha channel. You can choose to ignore it. You can choose a straight unmatted channel. You can pre-multiply, you can invert the alpha, or you can even have the program guess for you what the alpha is going to do. Now for this video, we actually don't have an alpha channel, so that's why it's grayed out. However, if you do have a video that contains alpha, you can come in here and you can play with those options. Coming down here to the frame rate, you can choose the frame rate from the file itself, which it was at 23.976 frames per second, or 24. You can also choose to conform the frame rate. So let's say you're working with all this footage that's at 15 frames per second, or 30 or 60, and this is the only file that's not. Well, you can come in here and you can change the frame rate. Now this may give you some wonky results depending on what your original frame rate is and what you want to change it to, so just be careful when you are conforming the frame rate. In addition to this, you can also choose the time code. You can use the source time code from the file, which is the default, or you can override the start time code and choose your own. So again, it just depends on how you want to work. You can also dictate the fields and pull downs. So if you want to interlace, you can come down here. You can choose the separate fields, upper field first or lower field. It's set to off since we want to do progressive. You can also come down here and remove the pull down if you want as well. Again, that's set to off. And you have some other options on the bottom, mainly pertaining to the pixel aspect ratio. This may seem familiar as we could do this with our compositions, but we can come in here and we can go from square pixels to anamorphic or anything in between. Again, it just depends on how you want to work with your footage. We can also loop the playback down here as well. And this window does get cut off, but those are all the options we have on this window. You're just not seeing the OK and cancel buttons on the bottom. Besides this, we also have color management, and you may recall with compositions, we could create different color profiles for them. Well, the same applies here for your clips. Depending on how your clips were encoded, you can choose different profiles if you want, and you can apply them accordingly. So those are the interpret footage options in After Effects. If you need to make some quick changes to your footage, this is where you can go before you start the editing process. As you start working with more complicated projects in After Effects, you're going to find that having multiple compositions can be very helpful. So how do you create additional compositions once you already have one made? Well, it's actually pretty easy to do. First, you can right-click on your project bin and choose New Composition. Or you can go up to Composition, New Composition. In addition to this, you can use the shortcut command Command-N or Control-N if you're on Windows. Now there's also a New Composition button in your project bin, which is right here. So you can click this to also create a new comp. Now you've seen these settings before. We talked about them when we were creating our first composition. One thing I want to point out that I forgot to touch on is that you can create additional presets should you need them. So let's say we come over here and we choose a default preset and we make some modifications, just like this. And for whatever reason we want to save this preset. Well, we can come up here and click this button. This will allow us to save the preset. All we need to do is name it. So in this case, I'll just name this My Preset. And then click OK. So we now have My Preset. If we come over here again, we can choose the default preset, or we can choose any of the custom presets we have down here. So My Preset, I made another one here when I was doing tests. So there's the TS preset, and so on and so forth. And at any time, if you ever want to delete a preset, simply select the preset and then hit the trash can icon, and then you can choose to delete it, just like that. So once you have a comp set up here, I'll just go ahead and choose these settings, and I'll name this to Awesome Comp. We can click OK, and you can see now we have a composition in the project bin. Now you can open up a composition by simply double-clicking on it. You'll also notice on the bottom we have tabs for our compositions, so we can just jump back and forth between them if we have multiple compositions open. And we can always X out of a composition by simply clicking on that X icon. This will close it off, and you can always reopen it by simply double-clicking. Let's say you're creating a composition and you don't know what the attributes should be. You don't know the resolution, you're not sure on the frame rate, you're not sure what you're going to be bringing in, and you don't want to go through and research it or look it up. Well, what you can do is take a video file that you've imported, or an image if you have it, and you can click and drag down to that composition button. Once you release, it'll create a new composition, as you can see, with the parameters of the footage. So this can be very useful and it can save you a lot of time. So keep that in mind as you start to create new compositions with different types of footage. And one final note, if you ever need to go back into your composition settings, with a composition on screen, you can always go up to Composition and then come down here to Composition Settings, or Command K or Control K if you're on Windows. Just like that, and it brings you back into those composition settings so you can change what you need to change, and then you can click OK, and then you are good to go. So that is how you add additional compositions to your project file. Working with your time controls is an important step when working in After Effects. This allows us to preview our work as well as jump back and forth between different points on our timeline. This is especially useful when you're working with more complicated effects and you need to animate them over the course of a video or animated project. So to get started, we have our Lesson 2 project file opened up, and once you have that on your screen, if you look to the right, you'll see we have a preview panel right here. This panel contains our video controls. So the first button that we can look at is the play button, which is pretty standard. I'm sure you know what this will do. We can go ahead and hit it, and you can see it will play the video out. So once we're good, we can hit the button again to pause the video. In addition to this, let's back up here. We can also use what is called RAM preview. Now, as you add different effects to your video, you may end up getting some slowdown. You can see right now it says frames per second is in real time, but as you add more stuff to your project, this may dip a bit, and you'll see the text in red, and it will tell you just how many frames per second it's playing at. So if you want a real-time preview, you can check out the RAM preview button. So let me just click it right here. And right now it's playing in real time. It's playing from the RAM. You can also hear it's playing the audio of the video, which can be useful, again, if you need to sync certain things up. So that's what that does for you. And again, that will become more useful as you start to add different effects to your project. We have other controls, such as the ability to jump to the last frame on the timeline. So right here, click it, you go to the last frame. If you click this one, you go to the first frame. There's also the ability to go forward one frame. So just one frame at a time. You can go back one frame at a time as well. You can mute your audio. So if you don't want to hear what's going on in the video clip, you can just click that button to mute. And you have the ability to do loop playback, single playback, or ping pong playback, which is right here. So by default, let me just come down here and I'll play it to the end of the video here. You can see when it gets to the end, it loops back to the beginning and continues to play. Well, if we click this, and now let's go close to the end again and hit the play button, you can see when it reaches the end, the playhead goes back in reverse, which can be useful if you're looking at certain effects. And then there is the play once button right here. If we play to the end, you can see that it then stops. So however you want to do it, you can set up your playback right here by clicking this button. Now, I mentioned what is called the playhead. That's right down here. You can see this blue icon with a red line. This is the indicator of where you're at on the timeline. You can click and hold on this blue icon and drag around to go back and forth on the timeline. You can see as I do this, I'm getting a live preview of what's going on the playback window. You also have your timeline broken down into seconds and frames. Right now you can see it's in seconds. You can expand this out if you wish, just by going like this. You can see now that we're going into frames, and we can really blow it out if we want so that we can go with every individual frame and see them and then work within that time frame if we wish. There's another way you can change the position of the playhead on the timeline as well. If we come over here to this box, we can click and drag on it to change the time on the timeline. In addition to this, if we want, we can click on this box and enter in a custom time. So let's try 7:01 and then hit enter. You can see now our playhead jumps to this precise moment on the timeline. You have a similar indicator right here. You can click this, enter in a time, and then you can go to the time that you indicate. When it comes to previewing your video, we talked about RAM preview. Let's say you just want to preview a small section of the video. You can easily do this by taking these blue markers right down here and moving them around. So I could click and drag on this, and you can see that there is a highlighted area versus a darker area. And I can move this around if I want to. I can also click and drag on this marker and move it back like so. So now if I were to click RAM preview, it only previews out that small section of the video. So that can be very useful, again, if you just want to work on certain parts of your film. If you want to bring the whole thing back to default, simply double click on the bar. If your preview is still choppy, you can always come up here and click on this drop-down box and choose what kind of resolution you want to run in. Right now it's set to auto, so it's going to fluctuate as I play, and if things get more complicated, it can go to a lower resolution, making my playback faster. Of course, your preview then will be of lesser quality, but you can choose to have this set to full, half, third, or quarter. Full, of course, will be full quality, half is half, and so on and so forth. So you can break this down and choose just how you want to preview your video when working in After Effects. So keep that in mind if you're having playback issues. You can always bring it down to wherever you need it to be. As you start working more with After Effects, you're going to discover that working with layers plays a huge role in creating a successful project. You will also discover that there are different types of layers, which we'll get to in future videos. Right now, we're just going to focus on the basics and the interface portion of the layer panel. So first, your layers are located right down here. You can see right now I only have one layer, and that is the video itself, right here. If I click on the drop-down arrow next to this video, you can see I have different properties that I can alter. And again, these are things we'll touch on in a later video, but just note, this is where you can gain access to different properties of your layers. In order to add a layer to the timeline, all you have to do is drag and drop. So we can come up here to our project bin, click on this video, and drag it down, release, and now we have a second layer on the timeline. You can also create additional layers by going up to Layer, New, and choosing a layer that you want. Now again, all these layers have different functions, and we'll be touching on how to use some of these in a later video. Down here, you have the ability to hide layers. So let's say you have one layer over another. Let me just take this and move it out like that. So if we click on the eyeball on the upper layer, it's going to hide it. You can see now we have the second layer, which I offset on screen. If I click it again, we'll bring that first layer back into view. Layers work in a hierarchy. The layers on top of the list are the ones you'll see first. You can also mute layers, so let's say they have audio. You can simply click on these to mute them, similar to the mute button in the preview panel. You can also solo tracks. So if I were to click on the solo button right here for the bottom layer, you can see it hides that first layer and brings in the second. Now, this is kind of like the hide and show button, except you don't have to go through and hide a bunch of layers if you just want to focus on one. So you can just click that and it will just show that one, and when you're done, click it again to bring everything back into view. You can also lock your layers. So right here, we can click to lock. So now I can't move this layer. If I click and drag, you can see nothing is happening. I won't be able to alter it in any way either. This can be useful, again, if you don't want to accidentally alter a layer and you want to keep it stationary for the time being. Let me just click that to bring it back. Finally, you can change your label colors for your layers. So I can click on this, and I could set this particular layer to, let's say, sandstone. You can see now it changes the label as well as the label on the timeline right here. You can see our timeline indicator is now sandstone color. So if I were to go down here, click, I could choose orange. You can see it changes it to orange in addition to the selection area as well. And as you can see, we have many different buttons here pertaining to your layers. They all do different things, and we'll be focusing on some of those later. Right now, I just wanted to give you a basic rundown of the layers panel and how you can interact with them. For most of this course, we'll be working with our compositions and the media inside them. However, there will come a point where we'll need to open up the video clips themselves and make edits, which are then applied to the composition. So this is a pretty simple process, but basically, we have a composition open right now, and you can tell this by looking up at the composition window. It says composition and then the name of the composition. We have a composition right here in our project panel. So how do we open up an actual layer or asset to work with it? Simply come down here to your timeline and double click on this piece of media. You can see we now have a new tab open and we're working with the layer. It says layer and then the video name. Now we can work with this piece of footage, edit it, and then go back to our composition when we're done. We'll be working with layers specifically when we get to the rotoscoping chapter in this series. And you'll see, as we make edits in rotoscoping, we'll be able to create a transparent background, which will then be applied to our composition. So just be aware that when you're working, for most of the time, at least in this course, we'll be in composition view. However, there will be times where you'll want to pop over to layer view to make some advanced edits.